Welcome all to today's presentation on Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It is the part of syllabus for first MA English. I am Dr. R. Saritha, Assistant Professor of English, Sri Sharda College for Women. Let's see the term fiction. Fiction is one of the literary genres. It is any narrative work which portrays individuals, events, or places which are completely imaginary. There are different types of fiction. In England, one of the earliest writers of fiction is Daniel Defoe. He wrote Robinson Crusoe. Generally speaking, 18th century saw the development of this genre, and during 19th century it became very popular among the people. Victorian Age is considered one of the glorious ages in England. It also saw emergence of important writers including Charlotte Bronte. She is considered as one of the earliest Victorian novelists. Now, let's see about Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte is an English writer who was born in 1816 in Yorkshire. Her parents were Patrick Bronte and Maria Branwell. Her siblings are Emily Bronte, Anne Bronte, and Patrick Branwell. The Bronte sisters contributed important literary works to the British literature. Charlotte Bronte wrote under the pseudonym Clara Bell. After much struggle, she published Jane Eyre in the year 1847 and gained recognition for the same novel. The novel is considered as a classic in English literature. Now, let's see the plot of the novel. In the beginning of the novel, Jane Eyre, the protagonist, is a 10-year-old orphan girl living with her aunt Reed family. The aunt's family is rich and they live at Gateshead Hall. Anne cares for her children and secludes Jane. On an unexpected fight between the cousin John Reed and Jane, the latter is punished and she is sent to a room known as Red Room. It is the abandoned room and Jane becomes unconscious after being locked up in the room for some time. Mr. Leod is called upon because he is an apothecary. He prescribes medicine for Jane's recovery. The next day, he meets Jane as she recovers from illness. Mr. Leod starts a conversation with Jane. Jane tells him that she wants to leave her aunt's home. Hence, Mr. Leod suggests her to go for the Lowood School to get education. Aunt Reed agrees for her departure. Through initial chapters, the readers realize that Jane is not treated well by the adopted family. She is in search of an identity and home. She is regarded as poor and hence she belongs to the lower class. Jane moves to Lowood School. She starts living in the Lowood School and she faces harsh difficulties. The school is run by Mr. Brocklehurst. In the school, she has to rise early and bath in extremely cold water. The teachers are strict except Miss Temple, the headmistress. Jane Eyre befriends Helen Burns. She is an intelligent and deeply religious child. Jane makes her as her idol and works hard to overcome her struggles in the school. She practices endurance and also learns to love her enemies. There's a sudden change in the school atmosphere with the arrival of spring season. Typhus fever affects all the students in the school. Helen suffers from typhus fever and she dies. Hence, Jane is very mortified. However, she remains ambitious and tries to complete her education. She continues her education for 6 years in Lowood School and successfully graduates from the school. She also works in the same school as a teacher for 2 years. After Miss Temple gets married, she realizes that a change is needed in her life. So she becomes a governess. She receives an annual salary of 30 pound by becoming a governess in a private home. Through her stay in Lowood, Jane learns to control her emotion and become an educated woman who can earn on her own. This elevates her status in the society. Jane starts working in Thornfield Hall, owned by Edward Rochester. Mrs. Alice Fairfax welcomes her and makes all the arrangements for a peaceful stay. She is going to teach and guide little Adlai Warrens, who's 7 or 8 years old. Adlai speaks French and a little English. After 6 months of stay only, Jane gets to meet Edward Rochester. She meets him through an accident and later realizes that he is the owner of Thornfield Hall. Jane interacts with Rochester only occasionally. Jane feels that he is cold and aloof. However, he is a successful businessman respected by others. Jane starts liking Edward Rochester. However, she knows that this is not proper and hence she hides her emotion within her heart. On one day, Edward Rochester tells Adlai's Warren history to Jane Eyre. She is the daughter of a French opera dancer, Céline Warens. Since Céline abandons Adlai, he brings the child from France to England. Jane's stay in Thornfield Hall gives her positive confidence because it is without any problem. She finds peace within herself and starts loving Edward Rochester as a change. One night, after hearing a shrill laugh, Jane goes outside her room and sees smoke coming out of Rochester's room. She finds out that the room is on fire and pours a bucket of water. Rochester thanks Jane and asks her to keep the incident a secret. He says it is the fault of the servant Gracepool who has started the fire. After this particular incident, the servant is not dismissed. Some other mysterious incidences also occur in Thornfield Hall, adding to the suspense element in the plot. Later, some guests arrive to Thornfield Hall. They are all friends of Edward Rochester. Particularly, the Ingram family is interested in Rochester. There are rumors that Blanche Ingram and Rochester are going to be married soon. The evenings in Thornfield Hall are joyous as all the guest members gather together. On one such occurrence, Rochester disguises himself as an old lady who tells fortunes. He enters in the disguise and tells the guests that he would like to tell the fortune of the unmarried ladies. He is a given chance by the guest members. So the first person to get her fortune told is Blanche Ingram. However, she comes back grim after listening to her fortune. Finally, Jane gets her fortune told. Jane meets the old lady and finds out the disguise. She identifies the old lady through her ring. It is none other than Edward Rochester himself. Then she tells her master that Mr. Mason, a friend from foreign, is waiting to see him. Rochester meets secretly this Mr. Mason. During the same night, a shrill voice calls for help. All the guests wake up. However, Rochester pacifies them and tells it is a servant's nightmare. This incident adds to the existing mystery. Jane does not sleep and goes over when Rochester calls for her help. Jane is taken to the third floor of Thornfield Hall and hears a dog growling sound in one of the rooms. They enter to the next room and sees wounded Mason, covered with blood. A particular doctor surgeon, Dr. Carter, clears the wound of Mr. Mason and takes him to his own home for recovery. This is all kept secret from the guest members. After some time, a coachman named Robert Levin comes to get Jane Eyre to meet and read so that A coachman named Robert Leven comes and fetches Jane Eyre so that she can go back to see a ailing Aunt Reed at Gateshead Hall. So she asks permission from Rochester. Rochester has also started liking Jane, but he does not confess his feeling. He wants to test her. So he builds up a story that he is marrying Blanche Ingram. However, this story is not true. This incident shows that Rochester is good at hiding things. Rochester is definitely mysterious with Jane. Jane gets permission and goes back to Gateshead Hall. She meets her ailing aunt. During their conversation, Anne feels guilty for Jane because she has hid the fact that her uncle John Eyre had written a letter to Reed telling that she wants to adopt Jane Eyre 3 years before. This Uncle John has been living in Madeira. However, Aunt Reed, because of her hatefulness for Jane, writes back to John Eyre informing him that she has died in Lowood School. However, after hearing all these stories, Jane forgives her aunt and she dies peacefully the same night. Through this incident, readers realize Jane learns to forgive people who had hurt her in the past. All these values has been learned by her during her stay in Lowood. Jane stays for more than 1 week in Gateshead Hall and she returns back to Thornfield Hall in a carriage. After some time, she starts walking towards her home. As she walks, she finds Edward Rochester sitting there outside their home. She becomes emotional. She remembers his marriage to Blanche Ingram. However, she hides her emotion and tells only that it is going to be her home only where Rochester is going to live in the future. On the same day, in the night, both Rochester and Jane converse in the garden. Jane is really sad. She tells Rochester and finally admits that her heart and soul will be always in Thornfield. After hearing this, Rochester hugs her and confesses her love to Jane. Jane is bewildered by this sudden change of action from Rochester. Rochester then calmly explains his whole false story about marrying Blanche Ingram. Jane is finally able to get her identity and home. A longing for one comes in the form of Rochester. They both decide to get married. Jane is set to marry Rochester within after next 4 weeks. He goes to Millcote for business and she becomes really restless, waiting for his return in rain. Because she had a nightmare about a child. This is a bad omen. When she wakes up from the dream, she sees a stranger inside the room who's tearing her wedding veil and she becomes unconscious due to fear. Rochester calms down. She tells that the stranger is graceful and she need not worry so that they can continue with their marriage. There are signs in the novel that indicate that bad things are bound to happen to Jane Eyre. The next day, Jane and Rochester are in church getting married. However, their marriage is interrupted by a stranger. His lawyer Briggs and tells to the gathering that Edward Rochester has been already married 15 years ago to Bertha Mason. This is proved by her brother Richard Mason, who had visited Rochester last time. So Rochester is angry and stops the marriage. He takes all of them to their home. In the third floor, in a room within a room, Bertha is locked and she is looked after by Graceful. Jane and others look at the extremely mad Bertha Mason. Rochester explains that Bertha has set fire to his room and she was the one who stabbed Richard Mason and she also tore the wedding veil. Richard Mason was informed about the marriage of Jane through her letter to John Eyre, who is also a friend of Mason family in Madeira. Both Briggs and Mason come to England and knowing that the marriage is stopped, they leave the place. Jane is deeply sad, and Rochester explains that he was tricked into marrying Bertha for an inheritance of 30,000 pounds. He realized her madness only after the marriage. Rochester breaks the trust of Jane. However, she listens to Rochester's story. Rochester traveled throughout Europe and he settled on England only after 4 years after their marriage. Bertha's madness becomes severe and her father dies meanwhile. Grace Poole and Dr. Carter are hired to both treat Bertha Mason. They are the two persons who knows the entire truth. After hearing all this story, Jane decides to leave Rochester because she feels she cannot be a mistress. She leaves that day and night without informing anybody. This shows that Jane has a sense of morality with her. Jane aimlessly walks and reaches Marsh End. She seeks help, and St. John River's family gives protection to her. She calls herself as Jane Elliot because she is afraid she will be found out. However, she tells that she was educated and she also worked in Lowood School. Mary and Diana Rivers like her, but they soon go away to distant home to become governesses because of their poor financial condition. Jane also starts working in the Morton parish as a school teacher for £30 a year salary. Jane fits herself within her new and surrounding. Jane is still heartbroken. However, she tries to immerse herself by teaching the kids in the new environment. One day, Jane St. John comes and reveals her real identity to Jane. He tells her that she is their cousin. John's mother is aunt to Jane. John Eyre has bequeathed his fortune of 20,000 pounds to Jane Eyre. Lawyer Brick has confirmed this information. Jane is extremely happy and shares her fortune to all her cousins so that each of them can receive 5,000 pounds equally. Jane has become rich and has become elevated in her social status. However, her heart is not at ease. Jane searches for Rochester by writing letters to Mrs. Fairfax and Briggs, but she does not receive any information on Rochester. Meanwhile, St. John's decides to work as a missionary in India. He proposes to Jane and asks to marry him, but she refuses him. Jane goes back searching for Rochester and informs this to her cousins. Jane once again goes back to Thornfield Hall in search of Rochester, but she is sad to see the burned house of Thornfield Hall. On inquiry, she finds that Bertha set fire to their home. She also jumped from the top floor, leading to her immediate death. Rochester saved all the family members, and finally, he became blind and crippled in the accident. He leads a quiet life now in Ferndean Mansion. Hence, hence, Jane decides to go and meet Rochester. Rochester is overwhelmed with happiness to see Jane back. He thanks God for giving Jane back. He calls his Skylark and decides to marry her without any further delay. In the final chapter, we see that Jane gets married to Rochester and informs her cousins about their marriage. Edward gets back his eyesight after 2 years, and Jane gives birth to a baby boy. After 10 years, Jane is happily married to Rochester. Both Diana and Mary are also married. St. John Rivers stays in India. This novel, Jane Eyre, shows the growth of the protagonist, Jane. It is a coming of age novel. Jane works hard and establishes herself in the society through education and lives a happy life after marriage. The following are the themes of the novel. Jane Eyre searches for her identity, love, and family. This she finds through Edward Rochester. The protagonist, Jane Eyre, is a victim of class division in Victorian England. Her status rises after she receives fortune from her uncle John Eyre. Christian values are also explained through the character Helen Burns in the novel. Hence, religion is also one of the themes of the novel. There are many weird incidences in the novel, so the readers can find that there are supernatural elements in the fiction. The Jane Eyre novel also belongs to the Gothic fiction. I would like to conclude today's presentation by saying that Jane Eyre is a classic in literature enjoyed by all the readers. These are the references for Jane Eyre. Thank you all for listening to the presentation.